Hello, I'm Dr. Andrew Newberg from Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia. I am presenting at the Conference on Worship and the Divine on the topic of the neurotheology of worship. And you might wonder, what exactly is neurotheology? Well, it's basically a field of study that seeks to understand the relationship or the link between our spiritual selves, our religious and spiritual selves, and our biological selves, what's going on in our brain and in our body. I'm very excited to be able to present this material at this conference because I think it's very helpful to be able to bring together a multidisciplinary kind of approach that incorporates the best of what so many of the philosophers and theologians here are able to look at and address in terms of the context of worship, as well as what I might be able to say in terms of what's going on in our brain and in our body when we engage in a practice such as worship. A couple of important points. First of all, with regard to neurotheology, as I said, it is a discipline that helps to establish the relationship or the link between our religious and spiritual selves and our neuroscientific self, our neurobiological self. But I want to be clear that this is not meant to be reductionistic. It is not a neuroscientific exploration of religion or of worship, and it is also not a religious or theological perspective on what science is, but rather it is both sides of neuro and theology coming together to help us best understand who we are as human beings, how we are religious and spiritual, and how we are biologically as well. When it comes to a neurotheological perspective, one of the first questions that I felt I needed to ask is, what exactly is worship? What are the elements of worship? To begin with, on a very simplistic level, part of what we need to think about is identifying an object of worship. Most often that object of worship is God, but certainly we have at times worshipped kings and queens, we've worshipped pharaohs, we have worshipped, in today's modern world, we have worshipped rock stars and actors and actresses. So there is always an object of worship, and that is something that our mind and our brain brings our attention to. There are other cognitive, emotional, experiential aspects of worship. There may be movements that we do. We may bow, we may say a prayer, we may engage in a kind of ritual that is part of the process of worship, and that's important as well. And then we have feelings. We feel something. We feel God's love. We feel joy. We feel awe as part of that experience. And if we feel these emotions, then most likely there's something going on in the emotional centers of our brain as well. Finally, there are the cognitive processes, what we think, what we believe. That's part of the worship process, and it's also affected by the worship process. When we worship God, there are certain aspects that become a part of who we are. We emulate God, we try to alter our behaviors, we might become more altruistic, more caring, more compassionate. All the things that we think about in the context of God, we try to bring that in the context of who we are as human beings. So with that in mind, the first part of what I was also trying to think about was, is there any explanation as to how worship became a part of humanity? Certainly there's the religious or theological perspective. God is in heaven, God is here in the universe, and we are connected to God in some way, and how we try to make that connection is through the process of worship. In that regard, worship is a part of who we are as human beings because of God, because of the religious and spiritual realm that we are a part of. But there are some possible scientific ideas about how worship may have become a part of who we are. We can turn to evolution and we can look at different animal species that we may ultimately have evolved from. I thought one of the most interesting possibilities is the relationship between worship in the context of specific insect species, like bees and ants who have a queen bee or a queen ant. Millions of other ants all work together, are all part of that entire hive solely for the kind of adulation and holding up of the single individual, this queen bee or this queen ant. They are even willing to give themselves in life to defend the queen because that is so important for them. And it helps to establish a very important hierarchy. But in many ways, there are some parallels between this incredibly high-ranking being of a queen ant and all of the servants that work for her, to how the relationship of God to us is, that God is this incredible being that we have no way of really being connected to in certain ways because we're all just doing the best we can in service to God. When we look at other animal species, particularly mammals and primates, most of the social species that we know of have some kind of hierarchical relationship. There are alpha males, there are matriarchs that run an entire herd of elephants, for example. And again, even in human beings, we have this notion of many of the civilizations that we've have had this kind of elevation of one particular individual, king, pharaoh, emperor, that is who we bow down to, who we surrender ourselves to, who we give ourselves to as part of that process. So there seems to be some biological proclivity for wanting to engage in the process of worship. Now from there we can start to talk a little bit about what's going on in the brain itself, and I've been involved in studying many different practices, many different rituals and contemplative practices that arguably are a part of worship for many individuals. So practices like meditation and prayer are frequently a part of the worship practices that people engage in. And we have done brain scan studies to be able to show different areas of the brain that are involved in those processes. When we talk about identifying the object of worship, well, maybe that is involved in the activity of what's going on in our frontal lobe, right behind our forehead. That part of our brain helps us to focus our attention and to bring our mind and our concentration on a particular object, on any object. So clearly, if it's an object of worship, then our frontal lobes are going to turn on. On the other hand, if we ultimately surrender ourselves to that object and we kind of allow ourselves to give ourselves over to that object of worship, what we have also noticed is that sometimes the frontal lobes start to drop in activity, they decrease. And that makes a lot of sense because when they are turned on, we are purposefully doing something like prayer or meditation, and when the frontal lobes are turned off, we are giving ourselves over, we are surrendering ourselves, we are submitting ourselves to that object of worship. Another important area of our brain is the parietal lobe, and that's located in the back of the brain. This is an area of our brain that helps us to establish our sense of self and how our self relates to other things in the world. So when you're talking about worship, you're talking about the relationship that you have with God. Well, when we have a very clear distinction between ourselves and other objects in the world, that's part of what our parietal lobe helps us to do. And we have proposed that when people are engaged in a practice like prayer, where they lose the boundary between themselves and an object like God, that activity in that parietal lobe actually starts to shut down. And again, that's exactly what we have seen on brain scan studies. This decrease of activity in the parietal lobe appears to be associated with a fundamental aspect of worship, which is that the sense of making a connection with God in such a very powerful way that helps to establish our actual relationship to God. Now, as I mentioned, there are other areas of our brain. In fact, when you actually think about it, it's almost the entire brain that becomes part of the worship process, the emotional centers of our brain that turn on when somebody has an experience of love, or when they engage, when they have a feeling of awe in the presence of God, or in a church or a synagogue, that they just feel this incredible, overwhelming, powerful feeling of what God is. Then these are emotional responses that we have. And in fact, there's a structure called the amygdala that turns on when something of motivational importance happens. Well, the motivational importance perfectly corresponds with the object of worship of God, and it would make sense that our amygdala would suddenly turn on and help us to identify that this is something incredibly important for us and an important part of what makes us who we are and what we need to do as part of the worship practice. Ultimately, all of this is felt not only in the brain, it's not only what's going on cognitively and emotionally, but it's felt throughout the body. And there's part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system that turns on the arousal and the calming parts of our body, so that when we engage in worship, we not only think about things or feel about things, but we feel it all the way through our body. We feel our heart, we feel our lungs, we feel our whole body. Everything becomes part of that worship practice. So in the end, what I hope this information is designed to help us with is to help everyone who is engaged in the discussion of worship to adapt at least an additional perspective. It doesn't get rid of the philosophical ideas, it doesn't get rid of the theological ideas about what worship is, but it helps to bring in this new perspective that we never had before. What's going on in our brain? What's going on in our body? Can we use this information to help address the questions about what exactly is worship? Are there different kinds of worship? Could we actually do brain scans to study different kinds of worship and try to see where the similarities and differences are? What are the elements of worship? And do we see the same elements of worship across traditions, across people? And are there ways of measuring and evaluating them? And ultimately, it's all about asking questions and asking questions about the subjective nature of these experiences, as well as what's ultimately going on in the biology of who we are. Hopefully all of that information can come together to help us gain a deeper understanding of the nature of worship and how worship is a fundamental part of human beings.